Hello and welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Mike Hodges. I'm here with Duff Crerar, and today we are going to talk about a new subject that has been on the minds of many people for a variety of reasons, and we'll kind of introduce that as we go. In the meantime, please, we've been doing this for a number of weeks. We would love to hear your questions and your thoughts on some of the topics we've been discussing and any new topics you'd like us to discuss further. So please send in your questions to the contact information that will be displayed on screen from time to time throughout the video, and we'll definitely gladly answer them as we can. For this week though, the topic is modern missions. For about 2,000 years now, the church has been doing cross-cultural missions, starting with the Jewish disciples to the Gentile nations around them. And since then, it's been a controversy. We have a lot of questions nowadays about the history of missions and the impact of missions, such to the effect that it's caused the church to rethink how we do it in the past. It's also caused the church and people outside the church to decide, is it even something we should be doing at all, cross-cultural missions specifically? So this is the topic we'd like to discuss this week. For the first bit, Duff is going to talk about some of the history and some of the things that we may or may not have clear about this. And then for the last while, Mark and Emmy Larson will be with us, and Duff will be talking with them about their own personal experiences in missions and how they've addressed these same questions in their own experience from both themselves and from other people. So without further ado, Duff will talk us through.
Sure, thanks, Mike. There are three ancient world religions that are missionary. Most of the rest of that age are not. Buddhism, Christianity, and then finally Islam.
Yes.
Those are the three that, out of the ancient world, project missions from the beginning. And in fact, the first missionaries in history are the Buddhist missionaries who string out of northern India across the Silk Road, and in the end carry on in China even after their original homeland rejects Buddhism for Hinduism.
Yes.
So there's also all characteristics of that are kind of fascinating because they're constant. You know, one of them, of course, is learning new languages. Another is dealing with opposition and persecution. Then there's the question of how do you adjust from the culture that your religion was born in to the culture you're going to.
Right.
We'll come back to that. Judaism doesn't do a lot of missions. When Judaism spreads, the way it spreads is the people are scattered, and then they set up synagogues. And the synagogues become kind of de facto mission stations. But there's no intentional mission. As we said in our discussion of the conquest a while ago, what God seems to set up with the conquest of Canaan is a kingdom that people will want to join rather than Jews going out to gather people and harvest them in. That's a Christian thing that comes along. So Christian missions begins with, as you said, the dilemma that everyone's Jewish. Culturally, Jesus wears a phylactery. Everyone either speaks Aramaic, or if they're religiously trained, they speak Hebrew. Coming in from the Roman world, the Hellenistic world of Greece and Rome, however, many of the Jews who've been living out there have been scattered for a couple of hundred years into different places. And most of them may not have spoken Hebrew or even Aramaic. They may have spoken Greek.
Right.
A few Latin speakers, maybe. So that's why the Pentecostal day, the day of Pentecost, is so revolutionary, because everyone hears the preaching of the apostles in their own language, including their own dialect, even. They hear the accents that they come from. And that is a miracle, because there were no missionaries trained with all those languages in one mental kit. Paul, when he goes out to do missions, is possibly better prepared than some, but there's not a lot of evidence that Paul was skilled in Latin. Greek, yes. He probably had pretty good working familiarity with Latin as a Roman citizen, but again, it may have been what we would call business Latin. And of course, Aramaic and Hebrew he would have had from school and from his mother's knee. But at the same time, there's culture involved. So for Paul to function the way he does, starting out in the synagogue, where he goes and travels across the Roman world, is the first place you can go where everybody knows what the rules are. They know the stories, and they know what the words mean, the connotations, and you can build on that. But eventually he'll end up in places where the synagogue doesn't exist, Philippi, or a place where the synagogue rejects them, and then they're on their own.
Yeah.
And here is where Paul is able to move into, especially in Galatia, the most radical statement of the first great mission, which is that in Christ it doesn't matter what culture you're from. If you're a Gentile, you don't need to be circumcised. The dietary laws are not for you.
Right.
There's just the basic stuff that's necessary for table fellowship. Don't gross out your Christian friends by putting something on that they don't like, and giving to the poor.
Yep.
So, that's a radical moment. That is the first moment where thinking and living like a Gentile becomes acceptable. And then the question for Paul becomes, how do I accommodate to that?
Right.
Because as a guest in any other culture than your own, there are rules written and unwritten. There's basic hospitality. The worst thing you can do is, as a missionary, as a friend of mine said, be a missionary, go live in Italy, and then say you're not going to have any wine, you're just going to have a Coke because you're an abstemious Puritan.
Right.
And you do that at the table with your Italian guest family, and they think, well, you're a boor, or a boor, one or the other.
Yeah.
So right away we have that challenge. How do you accommodate the culture without giving up the side? Because, of course, the Jewish church in Jerusalem is appalled. And how can you do this? How can you have one without the other?
Right.
And this sort of thing becomes the first great challenge, which is resolved by the first church council in Jerusalem, where James, who is speaking as a moderator of the Jewish side, and Peter comes and talks about how he baptized a Roman centurion.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, the issue is not so much that they baptized a non-Jew.
Because that happened all the time.
That's right. But they sat down and ate together.
Yeah.
Table fellowship was the deal.
It wasn't the ritual, it was the community.
Yeah, exactly. Now imagine how that becomes relatively unimportant for future missionaries. But it's just an example.
Yeah.
The way the pattern goes is, eventually the missionaries go to Rome. But the funny thing is, the Roman church wasn't founded by Peter or Paul. It was already there.
Yeah.
So we know that the Jews who are being scattered across from Jerusalem are going back to the diaspora with the experience of Pentecost and beginning the process. And we don't really know how far it goes. There's even rumors of some of them getting to the Roman garrisons in Britain and Gaul and places like that. But it does mean that in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, you have people who are intentionally crossing out of the Jewish culture, which Judaism and Christianity kind of part company in 70 AD, and by 130 AD, they're just not speaking anymore. So everyone's a Gentile practically. Then you have the question of, well, which Gentile going where?
The
Romans, of course, are conquering left and right, which creates this kind of general context where traveling out and converting people within the Roman Empire is relatively easy, except that the emperors every few years persecute you for being traitors. And we have 2 major persecutions which put a damper on missions. But after Rome becomes Christian, 313 to 325, we actually have the heads of state becoming Christians and forbidding persecution then. Then you have the question of, now what about out there, past the empire?
So kind of directing us forward with that, as the missions go past the empire in the early stages, how does the church start to address accommodations of cultures outside of what was authoritatively taught in the Bible? Because the Bible was the Gentile Roman culture and the Jewish culture.
Right.
So how do we start to get into discussions over the last 1,000 years of syncretism versus what does the biblical culture look like? What does Christian culture look like? How does the church start addressing this as they go?
Well, the first thing is languages. If you're going to go to the Goths, you've got to learn one of the Gothic languages, and there's several of them. You have to think about how you're going to explain things, the classic translator's dilemma. The 10 Commandments have to be worded in a way that relate to that culture. With the Goths, you often had to get them to realize that only one wife at a time was the standard. So there's those kinds of things, marriage culture, and of course polygamy remains an issue right up until the last century in terms of missions across to other cultures. The Goths are interesting because they don't even have writing. So you have to teach them how to read. You're going to have to give them an alphabet. You're going to have to write their language down before you can even translate the Bible into it. And for the sake of probably the greatest missionary to the Goths is a fellow named Ulfilas, who goes out and literally invents an alphabet, translates it, learns it and teaches it, so that actually the Goths are reading a Bible and have it written down for them. You can even look up the Lord's Prayer in Gothic now and have it on. It's on the net somewhere. But it demonstrates the challenge that a really gifted missionary has to be able to do. Plus, of course, the fact that you're not always going to be listened to. Ulfilas found the next best thing, too, was to get the conscience of the chief or the leaders. And that's what we see in other parts of the missionary movement for the next 150, 200 years. Find the king, convert the king, and then you have the weight of the state. And these
which is the exact opposite of what we learned from Joshua. Find the king instead of kill, convert the king.
That's right. Yet here we have convert the king.
Yeah.
What's interesting there, though, is there are certain kings after a certain period realize there are advantages to becoming a Christian.
Yeah.
So their conversion is not always the kind of conversion that we think of as authoritative. You know, what do these missionaries bring? Well, they bring writing.
Yeah.
They bring an alphabet. They have a language. They will translate the Bible, but they also become essential clerks, history makers, history chroniclers, correspondents. These monks, often they are monks, can write a letter. And that becomes really important. It's no coincidence that by 800 AD, the most powerful missionary movement in Europe is all these English monks going to the court of Charles the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor, and creating schools, inventing a new kind of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule, which everybody could read. It wasn't sloppy, it was neat, but also creating out of that, the church became the academy as well as the archivist, the historian, the diplomatic corps. And that becomes essential to the management of Carolingian society. Same thing, of course, in England. The Irish monks, who are famous for the way they spread all over Europe, do a lot of translating, and they always go around carrying their books with them. So bringing books, the codices, this style of book, appears in cultures that haven't got a thing written down. And now they have the Word of God. So this gives kings and chiefs an incentive to take care of their missionaries and protect them. The problem is it's uneven.
So along those lines, then, as the church expands, so starting in empirical Rome becomes the official state religion, and as it converts other states, if you want to call it that way, and allowing for farther afield as the home base becomes safe, if you want to call it that. What are some of the good things, the good decisions that the church made and the good effects that they had as they expanded with their missions, and what are some of the mistakes that they made from our modern perspective as far as being attached to the state that way?
Well, the biggest mistake in the Middle Ages was backing the Crusades. Because that killed any missionary outreach to Islam. And it created an enmity between the two. You know, you'll still...
So was that Christian missionaries, or was state operations? Well, like, what are some of the stories that we hear from Christian missionaries during that time?
Well, we have two missionaries to Islam, Francis of Assisi and Dominic, founder of the Dominican order. And they have an apologist. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas actually writes the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is an attempt to explain to Muslims, if they want to read it, and to Christians, if they will read it, why Islam is fulfilled by Christianity. It's actually very important that Thomas creates an understanding that reason itself and Islamic science and learning is not satanic. If it's good reason, it's good reason. It's just incomplete without revelation, the revelation of Jesus. So
the missionaries at these times then, because the Crusades is a word in our culture. So the missionaries at these times, were they stereotypically the Crusaders, or were they more antithetical to the Crusades?
Well, there were two kinds of clergy. One was the crusading clergy, who God wills it, God blesses it, you know, the kind of the extremes that often we think of as Christian imperialism, you know. But then these are the exceptions, who we think of as real missionaries. Francis, Dominic, Raymond of Lille. These are the guys that go out and cross over. They're not always understood. You know, I don't know that the head of the Muslims of Egypt ever really grasped what Francis was up to. But these are holy men of Jesus, and they should be respected. So they kind of create a precedent. And then out of that comes the Franciscan mission, which will take them all the way to the New World. the brown robe priest is a very much a Franciscan presence in Latin America.
So moving forward then, through those times, like 1200s, 1300s, 1500s, well, I guess not 1200s in the New World, but through those more recent years, I guess if you want to talk historically, some of the stereotype again is conquistadors and the Spanish, the plagues that came with them and all that kind of stuff, the mass genocide stuff. That's the stereotype we have. What are some of the things that the missionaries did that were good during that time?
Well, it's remarkable that when the conquistadors went to Latin America, they were interested in gold. They wanted to enslave the indigenous population. And it was, in fact, the Franciscans, led by Bartolomeo de las Casas, who went to the crown of Spain and said, you can't let this happen.
Right.
These are human beings. They have a status. The other scholars were saying, well, you know, if they're captured, then they're slaves, just like Aristotle said. But it was the Franciscan missionaries who said, no. These are souls.
Right.
They are human beings, and they should not be enslaved.
Yeah.
So they persuaded the Queen of Spain to make the indigenous population her special children to be protected, and the Franciscans, had a great victory there. Problem was, of course, the conquistadors found ways to legally use weasel words to get around it.
Right.
But the Franciscans become the people's protector, and their mission is to try to guard against slavery, the abuses of slavery.
Which kind of calls into question some of the larger hostile stereotypes we have of missionaries during the time.
Another classic case in Latin America are the Jesuits, who 2 centuries later are involved in Paraguay in creating these states and tribes which are protected and independent, and the Jesuits act as their diplomats and their educators, and then unfortunately the governments involved send in the troops and break them up, made famous by the film The Mission. And so we have then the idea that missionaries can also be persecuted by the people they go to. It's not unknown for missionaries to go over 100 years and none of them come back because they're all dead. But there's also those who are adopted and welcomed and who actually adopt the perspective and the cause, the identity of the people they serve, and then die with them in some cases as well.
So along those lines, just before we bring Mark and Emmy up, a lot of because they're going to be talking about more modern missions and their personal experience. So I kind of want to bring us forward a few more hundred years and talk about, just for a minute here, or a couple minutes, just kind of as the British Empire expands, did we as descendants of that culture, both Americans and Canadians, did we receive a more imperialistic mindset along those lines? Did we start to embrace the mission of culture, and did we as evangelicals start to, this is kind of a leading question, but I'm going to ask it, as evangelicals, did we start to embrace maybe as almost like a reformist combativeness against Catholicism, that we didn't want any kind of syncretism, so that we wanted our culture on theirs?
So let's do.
Was that something that we did?
We'll do 500 years of missionary history in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes,
To time me. Catholics launch international missions as we know it. By 1500, as the world is being expanded and explored by conquistadors, by explorers, the missionaries come with them. That's why Philippines is Catholic. There's a huge Catholic presence in southern India and around the world. Latin America, example. All these places show that if you're getting globalized in your transportation and you're globalized in your perspective economically, missionaries will want to come along with you and join the people and create the local churches. That means that missions, and the Catholics develop a whole institution around missionary work that includes China. And for many years, the only missionaries in China were the Jesuits. By about 1750, Protestantism, and this is primarily the Moravians and the English, really began to wrestle with the question of, shouldn't we be out there too? And so they start, as often, with the indigenous people of their colonies in the New World or places like that. But it's actually William Carey and others in America too, in the English-speaking Protestant world, who, because of their faith, their theology, that the gospel must be preached to every nation, and that also will advance the second coming of Christ, of course, when every nation has been reached. It's a major motivation for some denominations even today who send out missionaries. But nevertheless, they're the ones who break out of this cultural isolationism of the English-speaking world and go to places that maybe not even on the empire yet and begin to work. And of course, Burma is one of the places, India, parts of Africa, and you have the development eventually of China, inland China. These are places where you have Protestants beginning to pioneer, often with their governments opposing them, because they're bad for the drug trade, opium. They're bad for the slave trade. The initial British imperial thrust is not particularly benevolent. And remains unbenevolent until the mid-19th century. And the missionaries get in the way. They become advocates. They write letters to the editor back in the papers back home. They begin to speak about how terrible the conditions are because of uncontrolled imperialism. They oppose the opium trade, which is one of the ways the British used opium to break into China for commercial reasons. So then we have them, missionaries in that tradition, caught between their own colonial government sometimes and the people who are trying to figure out, what do these people really want? And then we have the challenge, whenever something goes wrong, the troops come in to restore order, and it creates the impression that missions depends upon the Gatling gun, the cannon, and the Marine. And so we have the problem then, and in some countries that's how it's done. You know, missions in Vietnam and Cambodia is done with the French Foreign Legion behind it. In Africa, quite often the same thing. So we have that problem then of how do you separate the automatic weapon, the colonial steamboat, the telegraph, the train from the gospel?
How do you separate the state that enables even the chance of missions, both the funding and the access, with the decidedly un-kingdom-like actions of a worldly state?
Well, the secret there, and it's really quite interesting how it develops. In the middle of the 19th century, early 19th century, the missionary society. Governments, mainline churches, they try, but they're clumsy. And you know, when you have to have an act of parliament to open a new church in England, people that want to do missions raise their own money. They find sponsors, and we begin to have these missionary societies of laymen. You know, China Inland Mission, Sudan Interior Mission. We have a host.
All the IMS.
No, hundreds of them now. You know, private missionary societies where well-endowed laymen support people who go out, learn the languages, go in, and die often of diseases or whatever to do it.
Which is how we get modern evangelical missions in its general structure right now, although it is shifting quite rapidly. With that, Duff, well, again, we could talk forever, but we want to give quite a bit of time to Mark and Imi. So I'm actually going to step off stage and invite them up, and they're going to talk with you about their current challenges, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
So let me introduce...
If you want to introduce them.
Mark and Imi. Mark and Imi attend the Church of Christ here in town. Mark and Imi have been in missions for a long time, in Niger in particular, part of former French colonial Africa. And Mark is a linguist, and Imi is everything, many different roles in the process. And they have operated as, how long have you actually been officially missionaries? And with which mission boards have you been?
Well, I landed in Nigeria in 1979, just turning 23.
Wow. 23.
I came a few years later, and that's where we met.
In the field?
In the field.
Wow, what do you know? So, first of all, what kind of education did you need?
Well, it's pretty much required to have some kind of an undergraduate degree to get kind of a long-term visa to stay in a developing country. So my first degree turned out to be a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from University of Illinois, and that was with our mission board, the SIM, Sudan Interior Mission, as it was known at the time. That was adequate to go for up to a 2-year short term. So my initial commitment was a 2-year short term. So I hadn't had what you'd call formal Bible theological training up to that point.
Well, Sudan Interior Mission is famous for employing engineers and doing developmental work. It's a full spectrum mission. It's not just there to preach. I think the stereotype of Sudan Interior Mission is preaching station which might have a church medical clinic, school, and then, if possible, a veterinary station as well. So it's almost the whole human spectrum. And this is why some governments, like Ethiopia, has developed a tolerance for missions, even when under Marxism they didn't like the missionaries very much. We didn't want them to preach, but they could still run the irrigation projects and development projects.
Famine relief.
Famine relief, absolutely.
That was big.
Yeah. So, but you obviously didn't stay as an agricultural consultant.
No, not for very long. As I was working in that area, it was kind of an extension program run through some local churches. There were small churches. This was in the north of Nigeria, which is primarily Islamic.
Okay.
But there are scattered groups of Christians. There was one particular group in some of the rural areas that had not really been Islamicized or thoroughly converted to Islam, and they were showing quite a bit of openness to the gospel. So through those churches, I was working alongside a Nigerian pastor who didn't speak any English.
Okay.
So that was great incentive for me to really pick up on the Hausa language, the predominant language there. So I got quite proficient in the language, and then in my second 2-year stint back in Nigeria, the mission was desperate for a Hausa language teacher.
Okay.
So they asked me to take up that job.
So you were working for them, the local national Christians weren't working for you?
Well, it was a partnership
Okay.
of the national church and SIM.
Okay, because that's something else I've noticed, is that often now it seems modern missionaries don't direct the work. They act actually as staff, and often the local churches direct the work themselves through their own government.
Yeah, this particular program I was in, it was relatively new, so it was, I would say, at the time that I was in it, it was pretty much missionary directed.
Okay.
But over time, more and more national staff kind of took on the leadership.
Okay, and what then took you into Niger, or Niger?
Well, when Amy and I met and then got married here in Grand Prairie, 1984, we were thinking we would be going back to Nigeria.
Okay.
Possibly teaching at a Bible school, something like that. Didn't really have a firm idea, but then a letter came to us from Niger asking if we would consider getting a Hausa language school established there, because at the time the number of missionaries in Nigeria actually ministering in Hausa language was on the downhill slide. But Niger, the church had not developed nearly as strongly as in Nigeria, so there was a continuing need for more people to come in and speak Hausa language, plus the level of education overall in the country was quite a bit lower than Nigeria.
Did you have trouble getting a visa?
For Niger, there was no problem.
Okay.
It was getting harder and harder for Nigeria, though.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So having missionaries coming, we had missionaries that were headed to Nigeria actually come to Niger to learn Hausa first. It was just simpler.
It's interesting, Nigeria went through a nationalist phase, and it became very anti-missionary in that period. I was thinking in the 80s, there was even the problems of getting over a civil war, as often is the case. And, speaking English didn't necessarily act as an asset to them because they were in a very anti-English mood.
Right.
But Niger, of course, is Francophone.
Right.
Right.
And a very different economy.
Okay.
We're talking like the poorest country in the world, like bottom of the UN's list of, what do they
Human
call it?
Development Index.
Yes, their
Okay,
Human
yeah.
Development Index. We are bottom of the list, right? So then we had a lot of conflict within the church when we first arrived there. The missionaries were in an uproar. We had a lot of older missionaries with very definite ideas of how to do missions. And we were young. I was, mid-20s, right, when we got there. So we were talking like there were old school missionaries there. And the conflicts that we came into were really discouraging. The church in Niger was looking at the church in Nigeria going, they're doing everything themselves. Why do we have to do what the missionaries say?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
But they also wanted control of the money, right? And where was the money coming from? It was coming from outside.
Right, right.
So as missionaries, you know, it's like, hey, we're bringing in the money, we want to control it.
Right, right. This is interesting because it means that the missionary is caught between the home sending agencies and countries and the people they're actually supposed to be on the same side with, and you don't get along, which is really tough.
It was.
Yeah, talk about being unwelcome. But how'd you work that out then?
It took years of really rough relationships. It was, sometimes we would have parallel things happening, like the church would decide to do a development project of some sort. They would hire somebody from somewhere else. Meanwhile, the mission that, you know, had started that church decades before was doing their own thing. And we even had divisions within the church. So there was the church that was like good with the mission. There was the church that wasn't good with the mission.
Wow.
Very interesting, yes.
And so what we're hearing then is, in a way, one church, two works, two ways of looking at things. And was it just a generational thing? Older and younger?
Tribal?
Tribal. Okay.
Partly.
Yes. Now, how does tribalism work in missionary work?
Well, it's tricky because as we were there, the mission was having more of an emphasis to go to some of the unreached groups in Niger. The focus had been from the beginning, we're talking back in the 1930s and 40s, was focus was on the Hausa speaking people, which is the majority or roughly half the population in Niger. And then in the 80s and 90s, the mission was changing focus to some of the other less reached groups like Fulani, Manga, So, it just turned out to be a different emphasis. And I think maybe part of it was turning that way. The evangelical church as a whole in North America was waking up to the fact that, there are still a lot of unreached people groups, and so there was that emphasis from North America.
Were the existing churches saying, no, we want you to stay and strengthen us and not go to the unreached, don't leave us? Or was there more of a protective instinct, or?
Yeah, I would say there was some of that, just because it was a kind of an upsetting of the apple cart, or the way that they had kind of gotten used to things, of being House of People being the focus, and then realizing, well, maybe they can't stay in the spotlight forever.
Now, this doesn't sound like what I hear from missionaries who come back and give field reports when I was a boy in the 60s and 70s. This doesn't sound like the mission stories that I was getting told, where everybody was getting along fine, and hundreds of people, smiling children, all that stuff. What is the biggest stereotype or the biggest misunderstandings we have of the modern missionary that you've encountered?
Well, how about the idea that missionaries are up on a pedestal? They've reached a certain point spiritually where they are good enough to be able to go and give, right? What we had in Niger was teams full of mavericks, right? we had people who had their own ideas of how things should be done, and they were tough enough to survive in a really tough country, and that meant there was conflict. We had conflict a lot of the time.
Yeah, it seems the history of missions is a lot of mavericks who, when they get together, don't often get along with each other. The famous missionary conference is 4 missionaries all walking in different directions, yelling over their shoulder at the others, because they are such strong personalities to get out there and deal with the isolation and everything else.
Yes.
What else were misjudgments or misperceptions of what a missionary is today?
Well, this kind of goes along with what Amy was saying about being on a pedestal. There's the saying, hopefully it's not being used that much anymore, that you're either a missionary or a mission field.
Oh, okay.
Implying that, if you're a missionary, well, you've got everything together. You are a totally mature spiritual person. But being honest about where I'm at, where we are as a couple, our missionary colleagues, we realize very soon we're not that mature. God has a lot of things He's got to work out in us, and we're not the paradigm of how to be the perfect Christ follower by any means. But
what about gender roles? The old days of missionary was a patriarchy. The man ran everything. In fact, women that went from my church, a Presbyterian church, to work in the hospitals, did it partly because they were feminists trying to get away from being bossed around by pastors at home. And then they would get there and discover they could run a whole hospital until the head supervisor came as a man and tried to tell them what to do. Did you find patriarchy, even now, an issue?
Well, we tried to change things a little. We were working in a country that was mainly Muslim, which, so the society that we were in had a certain perspective. But as missionaries coming from North America, there was this huge double standard going on at the time. For women in the evangelical church in North America were supposed to be stay-at-home moms, homeschool their kids, and then if you were a missionary woman, married with kids, you were supposed to work a full-time job, hire somebody to clean your house, hire somebody to cook for you, and send your kids to a boarding school because you're getting paid, right? So I told Mark first, and then the mission, that if I was going to have children, I was not sending them to a boarding school. So I rebelled and homeschooled our children and was able to help others homeschool, and we kind of changed how our mission.
Yeah, you reset the paradigm. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, it's interesting because, of course, most missionary agencies have a boarding school or two, different places, because the assumption is the missionary should be full-time in the work, not blending or watering down their time, even for their marriage, much less their family. And yet the challenge I have encountered is that many of the children of missionary boarding schools are resentful.
Oh, yeah.
Having difficulty with that. Other stereotypes that come along?
Well, I think one thing I've had to struggle with over the years is some of the earlier missionaries, maybe say pioneer missionaries, they did have kind of a paternalistic attitude, and I don't know how much consciously, but it did kind of promote an idea of dependence and a feeling that on the part of the national believer, well, this is my father or my patron spiritually,
right,
and that he kind of owes me a living, or just the expectation that this person is going to kind of be my ticket.
Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? You know, you have income, you appear rich, you have project money to develop, and there is that sense, as there was in their culture, that once you're a big man, you have obligations to the little men or women to help them. And I see that even in terms of the modern work on some of the mission stations, even when they're entirely nationally run. Some of the national men who have achieved positions of leadership are like the big men, the father figures, the sponsors, and everyone comes looking for employment and other things from them, which must undermine decision making, and of course create maybe factions, as well. So the human side of a culture, I said tribalism. There are places I know where I spent some time in Ethiopia, right? So there's Amhara, and there's Tigrinya, and there's Oromo, the biggest tribe, which has been out of power for many years. And so sometimes to have them work in the same place was very complicated because of the resentments, different languages as well. Now, this goes right back to the Goths. You know, these are kinds of issues that go along. Was there any way to work around those things, or any experience that was given to you where you could bring to that work to deal with tribes and tribalism?
That's something that I've thought about this in terms of like, okay, if we don't come in there with our agenda and we just come in with Jesus, what would Jesus do to that culture? Like, how would he affect how those people relate to each other?
Exactly.
Because I don't think that we had as much impact as we wanted to or thought we could. And back to the idea of that dependence, I was just going to say there were a couple of missionaries I can think of, old school missionaries, who challenged me in a way because they were able to get into the community and be accepted. I'm thinking of one in particular who died there. You know, he knew he was getting old or he was getting ill. He died out there with his children, right? And he had a relationship with those people that we didn't have, because I think we resented the whole, their dependence on us.
Right. The reason I say I'm picking up on this is the problem of what we call accommodation. You know, the first question that the ancient missionary people had from their supporters was, you're dressing like them, and you're speaking their language, and you're using their words, and next thing you know, you have house servants. You're actually living like they do. You know, you're not just eating their food and speaking their language. You're actually beginning to use non-Western ways of organizing life, getting things done. Next thing you know, you're acting like a local chief, or in your case, a father figure. And there were missionaries who were literally disciplined by the Vatican for being too Chinese in how they operated, you know. And the challenge, what I'm hearing here, is that to be accepted, you actually had to negotiate and even accept some parts of the culture that didn't really go well or naturally with you, for you, as Westerners. Would you say you were Africanized at all?
No, I would say that I was extremely stressed out by having to be two people at the same time.
Okay.
I was my North American self that needed to have a clean house. I needed to have my children educated. I needed to have certain kinds of food for my children, and I needed to be able to bring people into my home and welcome them to a house that looked the way I wanted it to look because of my North American upbringing. But at the same time, I had to be totally free with my schedule so that if somebody dropped by, I could welcome them in. And I had to dress like them because it would be offensive for me to go out without having a head covering and the proper clothing. So yes, I wore the Hausa clothing when we lived there, and I wore a head tie, and I hate having something like that on my head. It was it was terrible, but we did that. We ate their food. I remember a women's conference I went to with another missionary friend of mine, where we took part in the whole conference weekend. We just wanted to be with these women and show them, you know, that we were part of the group, right? And so we did their circle dances, and we wore their clothes. And then when it was time to eat, you know, they brought out the big tray of food and set it, you know, on the ground, on the mat, whatever, with all these women around. And then they brought two smaller dishes for us. And we're like, come on, come on, right? So another friend, national friend, took our dishes and just dumped them into the big dish, and we all ate together. And it felt really good to us. But then the next day, during the church service where everybody was present, the men and children and everybody, the offering was given in a special way where you had to like dance up the aisle to give the offering. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not going to do that. But then it was like, what we just went through yesterday, we just like did this lesson of like, you know, hey, we want to be like you. Now I can't pick and choose.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So Mark, it's more than just learning the language then.
The language is one thing, and figuring out the culture and what what's behind some of the words.
And
it takes a while.
You have to think Hausa as well, and think African. What is it working with men like then?
Well, one area, I guess, where I worked the most in terms of directly with nationals, because the bulk of my time was helping missionaries get started learning Hausa language.
Okay, right.
But for a while I was going out to some villages, and what we would do, we would have village evangelists from maybe 5 or 6 different villages come to kind of a central point, and just do a bit of Bible teaching and prayer together. It wasn't like, I mean, it was open in a sense that people in the village that were interested in kind of listening what it was about, basically just going through Bible stories. And so it had kind of an evangelistic function as well, but it was mainly just to be there as an encouragement to these evangelists who, it was a rough go for most of them in terms of finding people that were really interested in hearing the gospel. And
so they were being discouraged by lack of results, and you were there to boost their morale.
Yeah, that was kind of what I saw my role as.
Did you need to have your morale boosted? Who did that for you,
Well,
his personality helped him out, right?
Okay,
he didn't get as discouraged. But there was a time where I was like, what are we doing in this country? Nothing has changed. We've been here, we've sacrificed our youth, our 20s and 30s. We've been in this really hard place and nothing is changing. Why are we here? And at one point I was like, I think God just sends missionaries here that really need to have some rough edges worked off.
Right, it's for you and your walk as a Christian.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing a couple things. One is that the modern missionary is not somehow a super trained, super elite. Cultural adjustments are not easy. That basically in the end it's human beings who care, but who often feel like they've been thrown out there with a lot of people that they hardly know and understand that they have to start connecting with, right? Yeah. And then of course the challenge of there's the church and your church role, but there's also the question, can I be friends? And how do I become African enough to be accepted, but not to be rejected at home or, yourself? Mike, do you have a question coming in or anything like that?
Yeah, just off camera. So there's going to be 2 questions maybe just to finish up over the next 15 minutes or so, if that's okay. One, just along the terms of our topic, we had one question come in where, what are some of the lessons you've learned about, just along with the missions being valid, after your experience and through your experience working with other people, what do you think of that? And what does valid missions in the modern context look like? If you could speak a few comments along those lines. And then maybe just at the very end, we also had an interested party that's a bit sideways from our topic, but still relevant. And that is the current, what do you think of the current pandemic? And how has it provided a depression on missions or an opportunity for it? But the first question being very relevant to our topic, being just some thoughts about your lessons that you learned. What does valid missions look like now, given all the different generational and intercultural experiences you've had?
Good question.
Well, I think validity comes down in large part to being holistic, and that it's not just about preaching a spiritual message, but it's coming to people and taking time, trying to sit where they sit and listen and understand what are their needs health-wise, what are some of their spiritual issues. Again, in Africa, a big part of it is demonic. There's a lot of demonic activity going on, and people feel that oppression. It's a reality for many people there. So so it's seeing the person as a whole being with spiritual needs, with physical needs, emotional needs, trying to minister the way Jesus did. His description of teaching in the synagogues, meeting people what they need to understand, and preaching, kind of addressing the will. Who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve the old gods, the old ways? Or are you going to serve Jesus Christ? You're going to serve the living God, and then healing every disease and casting out demons. Where I've been most involved in recent years is Galmi Hospital, which has been running in Niger for over 60 years now. And the medical needs in that country are huge. And Galmi has literally saved thousands of lives, and through that had opportunity to share a bit of the gospel and their reason for being there to help people with their physical needs.
So as the Bible would say, you went to dwell among them.
Right.
And integrate that way and heal diseases, teach, whatever. But the whole idea is the living among them in the long term. That's very helpful. That's good. So different from the picture we have of missionaries constantly rallying people to live a Western way or adopt Western politics or Western ideas. You know? Yeah. And the other question was around the pandemic. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So I have been thinking about our daughter and her husband, and children, who are missionaries at this point in South Africa. And I was thinking about how the pandemic has affected them. Peter was actually able to start some courses because they're sitting at home, not doing what they had intended to be doing. What they miss desperately is the community. That's why they're there, is for that community. They're in a very different situation than we were in because they don't have the huge gap that we had as far as our income, right? So that they don't have the people dependent on them financially the way that we always felt, you know, that people just saw me as like dollar signs, right? But they're in a place where they can have relationships with people, and that's why they're there, and so that's what they've really been missing.
I know that in some of the cases, like in Ethiopia, for example, when the pandemic came, missionaries were pulled out by the hundreds back to their home countries by their boards because of the lack of medical care and the consideration that if you got sick with COVID in a country, you'd be taking a bed away from a local person who needed it, right? But that meant that there was a huge shipping out of people in March of 2020, and it's very hard to get them back in. Trickling back, now getting a visa is difficult. I suspect now with vaccines it'll help, but you know, even now to send them back is very hard. And if you're at the end of your time, close to retirement, and there are several in Ethiopia, why go back? You know, but it's not the way you planned to leave, you know, in such a way. It is a question, of course, does it mean when the missionaries are pulled home like that, that there's a providential impulse here for the church to stand on its own in those places? You know, in Ethiopia, the two national churches, besides the Orthodox Church, have had to really take over all their teachers, which is mostly what SIM had, and a few veterinarians and a few doctors. They're gone suddenly. They have to do it themselves. And then the question is that forcing them to realize that they can do it because it means they won't want missionaries or say they need them? Or will it free them up to go to unreached people, you know, in other parts of Ethiopia, for example? It's like, this is it's kind of like the war. World War II created a problem for missionaries as well. Getting to and from, you know, it's nothing like getting torpedoed on a ship back to America, coming home on furlough, you know. But also there was the challenge, I think, of churches being diverted and missionaries feeling cut off. And maybe falling back on the military forces that were in their region just to survive. Because it is true that you go to dwell among people, but the world as international people, missionaries feel those international things that they're still part of and conscious of, you know, and because of decisions made can have a big impact. So I know we're coming to the end of our time, and I also know that there may be other questions. So I do want to encourage everyone who's watching with questions to get them in and ideas. We're still looking for feedback and guidance from you folks. There's obviously a lot of things that we only opened up the discussion about. I want to thank you two for coming and being willing to be grilled like this, on cable. But it's also
better than being thrown into a boiling pot.
Well, there you go. That's right. Well, yeah, that's right. There are no small arms here or spears or anything. But it's important, I think, to thank you for willing to take the risk of jumping off into something that you really can't be prepared for entirely, and going there and going through the ups and downs and the isolation. I think for a lot of us, the idea of spending that much time away from the familiar is scary. And so we got to thank you for having the guts to try, and I think that's not wasted. In God's economy, that sort of thing is not wasted. It doesn't go to waste. So thank you for that. And thank you for the ideas that you've given us. And someday we'll have to have you come in and you can tell us your story of seeing writing in the sky and hearing angel choirs, but not tonight. Thank you very much. And thank you folks for being with us. Next week, we'll be looking at another topic of some interest. We're just not sure exactly which one yet. So do stay tuned and come back on Wednesday and we'll let you know. There seems to be no end of issues to talk about. Who knows, maybe we'll even be talking about closing churches and the relationship of church and state or church and government. Either way, stay tuned and keep an eye on what's going on out there that affects us as Christians, because chances are it'll come up here. We'll try to make some sense of it. Good night.